Almost always when I preach on the gospel readings. But today's the feast of St. Anthony, so I've got to talk a little bit about St. Anthony, and especially in the aspect that this year is a holy year, and we're called to be pilgrims of hope. Hope is a very precious word right about now, because a lot of us are frustrated, confused, the way things are going in the world. It seems like it's very difficult to hope. So maybe Anthony can teach us a little bit about that virtue and help us along on our own path. Now, Anthony was actually born in Lisbon in Portugal, and his baptismal name was not Anthony, it was Ferdinand. So if you ever visit Lisbon, please do not say Anthony of Padua. They get very upset. His name is Ferdinand of Lisbon. When he was still young, he joined the Augustinian order, and he was studying with the Augustinians. That's one of their charisms, to study. And he was living in Lisbon, but it wasn't working because his family also lived in Lisbon. And every week they were visiting him, bringing him food. He felt he didn't have time to really contemplate, time to pray. So he asked to be transferred to another friary in Coimbra. And in those days, Coimbra was actually the capital of Portugal. They transferred him up there. He was ordained, he was a teacher, but also he was the guest master. And one day, 5 beggars, that's what they looked like, came through. They were Franciscans. They were on their way to Morocco. So he hosted them, and they told him about being sent out to share the good news with the people of Islam. Well, about 5 months later, the relics of these men came back. And they're still stored in that church. That in fact, they were martyred for the faith. And Anthony was so moved by that, he asked his rector if he could leave the Augustinians. Now, I'm not sure our present Holy Father is going to be visiting Padua anytime soon. Remember, he is an Augustinian. Well, he asked the rector, and what did the rector say? Go make yourself a saint. And I've always wondered whether it was go make yourself a saint or go make yourself a saint. I suspect it was the latter. He moved to a little chapel not far away, dedicated to St. Anthony of the Desert. And that's where he got his new name. He took the name Anthony, got on a ship going to Morocco to become a martyr. That was his goal. He gets to Morocco and gets sick, never gets off the ship. He can't preach because he's too sick. So he decides he'll go back to Portugal. They take off, there's a storm, and the ship, instead of ending in Portugal, ends up in Sicily. Now that's like traveling to Columbus and ending up in San Antonio. It's way out of the way. Again, Anthony's plans didn't work. So when the Franciscans went up to Assisi for a gathering of all the Franciscans, he went along, and at the end of the week, they were all dividing to go to the friaries where they lived. But he didn't really have a home to go to. So he was kind of like the last kid chosen for the baseball team, sitting on the sidelines. And one of the guardians came up and said, we have a monastery in the hills, Monte San Paolo. How about you come and you be our priest? He was thrilled. Remember, this is what he wanted from the time he was a kid, to have time for contemplation, time for prayer. And it only lasted a few months. Because one day there was an ordination in the village in the valley. And they forgot to ask anyone to preach. Now, it was the Franciscans and the Dominicans. You would think Dominicans, order of preachers, somebody there would have been ready. But being good preachers, they decided that they wouldn't preach if they weren't prepared. You'll never hear a Franciscan say that. So they call on Anthony because they know he's educated. His homily is so beautiful that for the rest of his life, he was traveling and preaching and teaching. In fact, behind me you see the statue of St. Anthony. And in his hands, he holds a little document. he had written to St. Francis and said, "Is it okay if I teach the friars?" And you got to realize, Francis wasn't thrilled with teaching because he felt that sometimes overly educated people get uppity. They think they're better than everybody else. But he trusted Anthony. He had a nickname for him, my little bishop. And so he wrote, "Yes, you can teach, but with a spirit of prayer and devotion." That the prayer should lead him not to be arrogant, but to humility, to prayer. Well, these years of teaching and preaching through all these areas, it took a toll on Anthony. He would begin preaching at 5 in the morning, and he would go through, celebrate Mass, go to the confessional, and then go home around 6 at night. And those of you old enough, when did you have to fast from in the old days? From midnight. He had not eaten his first meal of the day until about 6 p.m. Now, some of the statues you see of St. Anthony, he looks a bit roly-poly. The reason for that is towards the end of his life, he suffered from liver failure. They found that out when they dug up his body. So it was edema. It was what they, I forget what they called it in those days. It wasn't fat. He was thrilled preaching. He was thrilled teaching. Well, eventually, as he continued to surrender, as he continued to recognize it wasn't his plan, it's what God wanted him to do, they brought him up to a place called Campo San Piero. Now, this is in northern Italy, and in northern Italy in the spring, there's a lot of humidity, a lot of moisture on the ground, and Anthony was suffering a lot from that. So the friars decided to build him a tree house. I'm not kidding. They built him a house in an oak tree. And that's why if you look back at the reliquary, doesn't it look like there's a tree surrounding it? That's what it refers to. And one day, one of the friars passed by, and he saw this light coming from the tree house. He thought it was on fire. So he rushed up the tree to save Anthony, opened the door, and there's Anthony holding the child Jesus in his arms. He had surrendered enough, become vulnerable enough to be able to be innocent enough to hold the child Jesus. He was a man of hope. With all the crazy things going on in our world, we have to be people of hope, pilgrims of hope. People have to see that we're not allowing this to destroy our faith or our life. You can tell if a person's filled with anxiety, can't you? I mean, even our pets can. If you're filled with anxiety, what does your dog do? Sits at your feet. What does your cat do? Nothing. It knows you're anxious. It doesn't care, right? People can see if we're filled with hope. People can see if we believe that even though things seem to be going wrong now, we know Jesus will always be with us. They can see if we've surrendered to whatever God is calling us to. And in fact, if we do this well enough, they'll see we're holding the child Jesus. Maybe not in our arms, but certainly in our hearts.